I'll never forget the first time I heard the HOA president stand in front of us and say, "KO, children should not be running around outside. It disrupts the peace and beauty of our neighborhood." I thought it was some sort of joke. Who in there? Right mind tells kids they can't play outside. But it wasn't a joke. It was the beginning of a nightmare that turned our once peaceful community into a battleground. It started small. Notices were slipped into mailboxes about limiting noise disturbances. Then came the fines. If a child was seen riding a bike on the sidewalk, parents received a $50 penalty. If kids were playing tag on the grass, it became a $100 violation. For property damage, parents were furious, but the HOA acted as though this was law, as though they had the power to control childhood itself. I lived in this neighborhood my entire life. I grew up climbing those same trees, racing down those same sidewalks, and laughing with friends until the streetlights came on. Seeing the children silenced, trapped indoors like prisoners, was heartbreaking. The sound of laughter was replaced by the sound of silence, and the streets became ghostly. But one parent decided enough was enough. His name was Daniel. He was a single father, raising 2 kids, my age 9, and Lucas, age 6. They were bright, energetic children who loved soccer, bike rides, and chasing fireflies. But overnight, they became targets of the HOA's obsession with order. One summer evening, Daniel was sitting on his porch while his kids played kickball in front of their home. A car pulled up. It was the HOA president herself, Karen. She marched up to Daniel and scolded him in front of his children. "You're in violation of community rules. Your children cannot play outside unsupervised, and certainly not with that kind of noise. Expect a fine." Daniel tried to reason with her, but Karen wouldn't budge. She claimed it was about preserving property values and maintaining peace. But everyone knew the truth. Karen despised the sound of kids being kids. The next day, Daniel received an official letter, a $200 fine for excessive outdoor play. That was the moment he decided to fight back. Daniel wasn't a lawyer, but he was smart. He researched, he read state laws, local ordinances, and HOA bylaws. What he discovered made his blood boil. The HOA had overstepped its authority. They had no legal right to restrict children from playing outdoors. In fact, their rules were not only unreasonable, they bordered on discriminatory. Daniel wasn't just fighting for his own kids anymore. He was fighting for every child in the neighborhood. Quietly, he started talking to other parents. One by one, they joined him. Stories poured out: kids being yelled at for riding scooters, parents being fined for sidewalk chalk drawings. Even toddlers scolded for laughing too loudly at the playground. The neighborhood had been living under the HOA's thumb for too long. But Daniel gave them courage, and then came the day that changed everything. Daniel filed a lawsuit against the HOA, not just for himself, but as a class action on behalf of every family in the community. His claim was simple. Children have the right to play, and the HOA had gone too far in trying to strip away something as natural and necessary as outdoor childhood. The lawsuit hit the neighborhood like a lightning bolt. The HOA board panicked. Karen fumed. Parents who had once been afraid to speak up finally felt empowered. Some even offered to testify in court, sharing stories of harassment. Fines meant intimidation. It was no longer just about kickball or bike rides. It was about freedom, family, and the soul of the community. But the HOA wasn't going down quietly. They hired expensive lawyers, argued that they were protecting property values, and painted Daniel as a reckless parent who allowed his kids to disturb others. But Daniel had something stronger: truth, evidence, and a community that had been silenced for too long. The trial was set. And when the day came, the courtroom overflowed with parents, children, and even neighbors who didn't have kids but believed in the cause. For the first time, the HOA had to face the people they had bullied for years. What happened next would shock everyone, forever change the future of our neighborhood. When the HOA doubled down on their so-called community rules, things got even worse. It wasn't just about kids running around anymore. They started sending letters to families if a bicycle was left leaning against the porch for more than 10 minutes. They fined parents if a basketball hoop was visible in the driveway. Even chalk drawings on the sidewalk, the kind kids love to make on sunny afternoons, were labeled graffiti and fined. The tension in the neighborhood grew. With every notice, every threat, every ridiculous fine, parents were on edge. Kids felt like they were in trouble just for existing outside their front door. But while most families complained in whispers and behind closed doors, one parent finally decided enough was enough. Her name was Maria. She was a single mom raising her 8-year-old son. Lucas Maria worked long hours, but she believed in giving her son the kind of childhood she never had, running free, laughing with friends, and learning to enjoy life outside of screens and walls. When the HOA sent her a warning letter because Lucas was seen playing tag with a friend on the grass near the community park, something in Maria snapped. She wasn't going to apologize for letting her kid be a kid. She wasn't going to pay hundreds of dollars in fines just because her son dared to laugh outside. That's when Maria began digging deeper into the HOA's rules, contracts, and even local laws. And what she discovered shook the entire foundation of the neighborhood. The HOA president, a man named Richard, had been rewriting community guidelines over the years without the proper approval of the majority of homeowners. He had been slipping in rules that gave him more control, more power, and more leverage to fine families. And while most homeowners assumed these rules were legally binding, Maria realized something crucial: many of them were not. With the help of a local attorney, she filed a lawsuit against the HOA, claiming their ban on children playing outside was not only unenforceable, but also discriminatory. After all, what kind of community punishes families for allowing children to enjoy the outdoors? The lawsuit sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Parents who had been quietly suffering finally had a voice. Families rallied behind Maria, offering to testify, sharing their own stories of fines and harassment. Even residents without kids supported her, realizing that if the HOA could strip away something as basic as outdoor play, then no one's freedom in the neighborhood was safe. But Richard wasn't about to back down. He was furious, convinced that Maria was just a troublemaker trying to undermine his authority. He called emergency HOA meetings, pressured board members, and even tried to intimidate Maria with threats of further fines and legal costs. He thought he could break her spirit the way he had with so many other families. But this time was different. This time, the neighborhood wasn't scared anymore. They were watching closely, and for the first time, they were united. As the case headed toward the courtroom, the entire neighborhood held its breath. Would the HOA win again with their endless rules and fines? Or would Maria's fight finally expose the truth and set a new standard for the rights of families everywhere? The trial was about to begin, and with it, the battle that would decide the future of the neighborhood. The HOA thought they had everything under control after issuing fines and threatening more families. The playground was empty most days, swings creaking in the wind, slides collecting dust. But behind closed doors, parents were meeting in secret, whispering about their growing frustration. The entire neighborhood was beginning to feel like a prison. No bikes on the sidewalks, no chalk drawings on the pavement, and now, no kids playing outside. It wasn't a community anymore. It was a cage. One parent, a woman named Denise, finally snapped. Her youngest daughter came home in tears one afternoon, clutching a warning slip from the HOA for riding her scooter on the driveway. Denise's voice cracked as she told her husband, "I'm done being silent. They're not just policing us, they're destroying childhood." Denise reached out to Tom, the dad who had already begun challenging the HOA. Together, they gathered More parents sitting in living rooms late at night, spreading paperwork and copies of the HOA bylaws across kitchen tables. That's when they discovered something shocking. The HOA rules didn't actually give them the authority to ban children from using common spaces the way they had. The president had been twisting vague language into something harsher, all to enforce his own vision of peace and order. Fueled by anger and determination, Denise took the boldest step yet. She filed a lawsuit. The filing shook the neighborhood like an earthquake. Word spread quickly, and soon everyone was talking. Some whispered that Denise had just signed her family's eviction papers, while others quietly hoped she might be the one to finally stand up for them all. The HOA president, smug as ever, tried to intimidate her. He showed up at her doorstep, waving a letter that threatened escalating fines and even legal action of his own. Denise didn't flinch. She looked him straight in the eye and said, "See you in court." Then she shut the door in his face. The lawsuit opened old wounds in the community. Some neighbors sided with the HOA, fearful of property values and conflict. Others began dropping off casseroles and baked goods at Denise's door, quiet symbols of support. At night, kids would gather in her yard, finally laughing again, their parents daring to let them play under the cover of darkness. The first court hearing was tense. The HOA's attorney painted a picture of chaos: bikes damaging sidewalks, children disrupting the neighborhood, safety concerns everywhere. But Denise's lawyer countered with something more powerful: the truth. She brought pictures of the empty playgrounds, testimony from children who felt trapped inside their own homes, and even statements from doctors explaining how harmful it was for kids to be kept indoors. The judge didn't issue a ruling that day, but he made it clear the HOA had overstepped its authority. It was a crack in the armor, and the community felt it. Parents began speaking up at meetings. Voices that had been silent for months were now rising together. But the HOA wasn't done. The president doubled down, sending security to patrol the neighborhood and ordering warning letters for any family that allowed kids outside. The neighborhood was now divided between those who feared retaliation and those ready to fight for freedom, and in the middle of it all was Denise's mother, neighbor, fighter who had lit a spark that no amount of intimidation could extinguish. The neighborhood was no longer just waiting for change. They were preparing for a battle that would decide who truly had control: the people who lived there or the board that claimed to own them. By the time the summer rolled around, the fight between the HOA and the families had reached a boiling point. Kids were stuck inside during the hottest, brightest days, peering through the blinds at empty streets where bicycles once zipped by, and chalk drawings once decorated the sidewalks. Parents were restless too, their frustrations simmering into late-night conversations, whispered plans, and finally, decisive action. David knew the lawsuit was the right step, but he had underestimated the lengths the HOA would go to fight back. Almost immediately after filing, he began receiving letters threatening counterclaims, accusing him of slander, and even alleging that his children had damaged common property simply by playing hopscotch on the pavement. It was a barrage of intimidation tactics meant to scare him into backing down. But David wasn't backing down. He stood firm, attending every meeting, every court date with a calm, steady presence. His attorney, a sharp woman named Clara, who specialized in civil liberties, warned him, "They're going to try to drag this out. Their hope is to make you give up before the truth comes to light." Meanwhile, the HOA president, a rigid man named Robert, grew more defiant. He framed the issue as one of community, order, and safety, spinning stories of supposed damage caused by children's scratches on a bench, scuffs on the pavement, things that could happen naturally over time. But David noticed that the more Robert pushed his narrative, the more cracks began to appear in his control over the community. Parents who had once been hesitant to speak up started to find their voices. At a particularly heated HOA meeting, A mother stood up and shouted, "You've turned this neighborhood into a prison for our children. They're not criminals, they're kids, and kids need to play." Others joined her, clapping, shouting, demanding answers. For the first time, Robert's gavel couldn't silence the room. The media caught wind of the story. A local news crew showed up, cameras capturing parents holding handmade signs that read, "Let kids be kids and play is not a crime." Interviews with tearful mothers and frustrated fathers aired on the evening news, painting the HOA as the villain in a story that resonated with families far beyond the neighborhood. The pressure grew, but so did the stakes. David received anonymous letters slipped under his door, warning him to drop the case or face consequences. One night, his car tires were slashed, a petty act of vandalism that left his children frightened. He sat them down and reassured them. What we're doing is right. And when people know they're wrong, they get desperate. That's why they're trying to scare us, but we don't quit. As the lawsuit progressed, Clara uncovered a crucial piece of evidence. Buried in the HOA's bylaws was a section contradicting Robert's ban entirely. Decades ago, when the neighborhood was first developed, the bylaw specifically mentioned preserving family-friendly spaces and ensuring children had safe outdoor areas to play. Robert's so-called rules were nothing more than his personal crusade, enforced through intimidation and false authority. When Clara presented this in court, the judge's eyebrows rose. "So you're telling me," he said, leaning forward, "that this entire ban on children playing outside has no legal basis within the HOA's own governing documents?" Robert sputtered, tried to spin the language, but the damage was done. The courtroom murmured with disbelief. David sat quietly, hands folded, knowing they had finally exposed the truth. But the battle wasn't over. The HOA wasn't just going to roll over and admit defeat. They launched a desperate attempt to amend the bylaws retroactively, calling for an emergency vote among homeowners to cement the ban into official policy. It was a dirty move, one that could undermine everything David had fought for. That's when the community truly rallied. Parents went door to door, talking to neighbors, urging them to vote against the amendment. Even residents without children realized what was at stake. If they can take away kids' right to play, one elderly neighbor said, what will they take away from us next? Our gardens, our gatherings, our freedom. The vote became the neighborhood's defining moment. People who had never attended a meeting before packed the hall, voices echoing with passion and anger. When the ballots were counted, the amendment failed by a landslide. The ban was effectively dead. But David knew Robert wouldn't accept defeat easily. The final showdown was yet to come, and it would determine not just the fate of the children's right to play, but the very future of the HOA itself. The courtroom had become the battlefield where the future of our neighborhood would be decided. After weeks of hearings, testimonies, and evidence, the case had boiled down to this final day. Everyone in the community had their eyes on the outcome. Because it wasn't just about children playing anymore, it was about whether an HOA could overreach so far into people's lives that they stripped away the simple joys of living. The HOA's attorney stood tall, delivering his closing argument with the same arrogance that had fueled the board all along. He painted a picture of disorder and unsafe conditions, blaming children's laughter for noise complaints, citing minor trampled flower beds as property destruction, and even going as far as claiming kids playing outside threatened the neighborhood's real estate value. It was outrageous, but he spoke with such certainty that a few heads in the courtroom nodded in agreement. Then my attorney rose to speak. He reminded the court of what this case was truly about: the fundamental right of families to live freely in their homes. He held up pictures we had submitted of children drawing chalk art on sidewalks, neighbors gathering to watch kids play tag, and even of my daughter's smile the day she learned to ride her bike in front of our house. He told the judge, This isn't about noise. This isn't about property. This is about stripping away the very heartbeat of a neighborhood, its children. The silence that followed was thick. The judge leaned back, her eyes scanning the room, and then she delivered. Her verdict: the HOA's restrictions banning children from playing outside are declared unreasonable, unlawful, and unenforceable. The HOA will immediately cease enforcement of these rules. Furthermore, damages shall be awarded to the plaintiff for emotional distress and legal costs. The words struck the board like a hammer. Karen, the HOA president, looked like she'd swallowed a lemon whole. The rest of the board slumped in their seats, realizing their unchecked power had just collapsed in front of everyone. As for me, I felt a surge of relief so powerful I nearly cried right there. My daughter squeezed my hand and whispered, "Does this mean I can ride my bike again?" I laughed through the tears. "Yes, sweetheart, you can." But the story didn't end in the courtroom. The ruling sparked a ripple effect. News stations picked up the story, dubbing it the HOA that tried to ban childhood. Parents across the country started contacting me, sharing their own battles with unreasonable HOAs. Some even began pushing for new legislation to limit the authority of neighborhood boards. What started as a fight for my daughter's right to play had turned into a movement much larger than I could have ever imagined. Back in our neighborhood, things changed overnight. The chalk drawings returned. The sound of laughter echoed once again through the cul-de-sacs. Even neighbors who had once sided with the HOA began joining in, bringing lemonade stands, organizing block parties, and turning the community into something it had never been before: alive. And as for Karen and her loyal followers, their power crumbled. At the next HOA election, nearly every board member was replaced. The new leadership focused on community events, fairness, and creating a neighborhood where everyone could belong. The lawsuit hadn't just won us freedom. It had restored our sense of community. Looking back, I realized something important. It's easy to let rules, fear, or people in power strip away the little joys in life. But when you stand up, not just for yourself, but for what's right, you don't just change your own story. You change everyone's. So now, every time I see my daughter pedaling down the street with her friends racing beside her, I smile. Because I know that laughter, that freedom, and that joy were worth every single moment of the fight. And that's the story of how one lawsuit changed everything, not just for my family, but for the entire neighborhood. If you've ever dealt with an unreasonable HOA, remember this: you have more power than you think. Sometimes all it takes is one person to push back and the whole house of cards falls apart.